May the words that I speak and the thoughts and wanderings of all of our hearts draw us closer to God, who is our rock and our Redeemer. Our scriptures today tell stories of suffering and might open a door for us to go into the places we don't always want to go. You see, we need to grieve. We need to face our emptiness and loneliness and know that God cares. If we keep it all walled off and don't go there and don't feel what we need to feel, we don't have the opportunity to feel God's healing love coming into us and helping us get through it. And this has been 15 months of grief, 15 months of missed family dinners, 15 months of not seeing the new baby, 15 months of not hugging our grandparents. It's been really hard. And a lot of the time it feels like we just got to keep that stiff upper lip and get through it. But our scriptures today tell a very different story about dealing with suffering. We have David mourning the death of Saul and Jonathan. And this isn't a simple grief. It isn't just David and his lover and his lover's father, and they all were one happy little group. It's David and his lover and his lover's father who wants to kill David. Not necessarily because he's his lover, but because he's jealous of him. Because David has been doing better than Saul. David keeps going out and winning wars and doing good things, and then these women dancing and singing in the streets come up quite a bit in these stories from Samuel. The women in the streets are singing songs that Saul killed 1,000, but David killed 10,000, kind of making fun of Saul. And Saul was really insecure about it. He had a really weird relationship with David. He wanted David to come and play the harp, and then he wanted to kill David. And, all of this, and then eventually Saul dies in battle against the Philistines. And David is just struck down with grief for Jonathan, grief for Saul. And he does not want the daughters of his enemies, he does not want them making fun of Saul in the streets. And so he makes that clear as he is, becoming king, as he's stepping into this role. He's also deeply grieving, and he's not hiding that. Calling out to God. You can do that. Do that in your house by yourself. Do that on the street corners, but it's not very Verdun-like. A lot of people don't do that in the streets of Verdun. Go somewhere by yourself in the woods and lament. Let it out. Say or sing your sadness. And I think of David stepping into the throne while also complicated grieving, Saul's death. And it makes me think to some extent of what happens around some funerals. Remember when we used to have those? But we still have the deaths and we still have to deal with them. When the person who has been the magnet that holds the family together dies, and you can see somebody else in the middle of their grief stepping in to that role. So who's going to host the family dinners? Who's going to keep touch with everyone and remember everyone's birthdays? That even in the midst of our grief, we assume the mantle that comes upon us. So I want to move into how both Jairus and the woman who touched Jesus' cloak are also entered deeply into their suffering, or perhaps they can't even get out of it, and they have come to Jesus. And I think that this is important. This story is important for a lot of reasons. It takes two healing stories and makes a sandwich of them. Because when we hear Jesus' healing stories, there's always more to it than just Jesus heals somebody. It tells us something about Jesus, and it tells us about who we are before Jesus. The first person to come up to Jesus is Jairus, and he is a leader in the synagogue. Now, the leaders of the synagogue have not been overly thrilled with Jesus. He's pushing boundaries that they don't necessarily want pushed. So Jesus is a part of the synagogue, but he's attracting a lot of attention. And so this is all internal strife between him and his own leaders. It's some of what can sometimes happen when you get someone who has a very prophetic voice, and the mainstream of their denomination, of their church, just isn't ready to hear it. But by this point in the Gospel of Mark, the synagogue leaders are not necessarily all that fond of Jesus. But this synagogue leader has heard that he does miracles, and so he lays aside his in-group belonging to go and ask for Jesus' help. Okay. Now, if the synagogue leaders aren't all that keen on Jesus, if Jesus has been kind of pushing their buttons and he wants to make things better with them, healing Jairus' daughter might be something that would do just that. And I want to sort of imagine, if you've seen Jesus Christ Superstar, the way that Judas is portrayed in that story, I want to imagine a disciple of Jesus who really wants Jesus to do well and has their own ideas about how he should do it. And so I can imagine, we'll say it's Judas, saying it to himself as this is happening. Oh, good, Jesus is going to go and do this healing, and it's going to help mend this rift, and we'll be able to work together better with the synagogue. Oh, that is the yearning that you can see through the early writings of the New Testament, that the synagogue and the followers of Jesus would be able to get along. But what you see behind the scenes and under the scenes, as you get into later writings, the gospel writings, especially John, that gets pushed and it gets too far. They become separate. They have to separate and become two separate, eventually, religions. And a lot of our scripture writings come during that struggle, which has partially led, unfortunately, as Christians went from being a minority group within the synagogue to being a majority group in the wider world. It has meant that we have taken these words spoken in this time of relationship breaking. And if you've ever heard the expression punching up, so if you are less powerful and you condemn the actions of someone who is more powerful, it's a lot different than if you're powerful and you condemn the actions of someone who's less powerful. So you have the Christians who are less powerful writing things that are really condemning of the more powerful Jewish religious authorities. Then the tables turned, and those same words were then used to punch down. And that is wrong, and that is always wrong, and we have to stand against that because it weaves throughout our scriptures. So we have, I'm putting all this out there because the context is that Jesus and the synagogue leaders have a rough relationship, but the negatives that are attributed to the synagogue leaders, we need to see those within ourselves. They do not reflect modern Judaism. They just don't. So we have to realize that that we have to imagine this story that Jesus is speaking to his own religious authorities. And so this might seem like a big aside, but Jesus is is on his way to heal this girl. And I can imagine Judas saying, hey, this is good. Jesus is going to heal Jairus' daughter. That's going to help ease things along. We'll get along better with the synagogue. And then somebody touches Jesus' robe. And, of course, the crowd is pushing in. And I can just hear Judas thinking, when Jesus stops and says, who touched my robe? I can just hear Judas, as this character, I've invented it to some extent right now, saying, no. Don't stop, don't draw attention to it, because that will make you impure. If somebody touched your robe and that makes you impure because they're impure, then you can't go into Jairus' house. And we're not going to get along better with the synagogue leaders if you do that. But Jesus stops and he insists, who touched me? And these are small towns. These aren't big cities. Everybody knew this woman, and everybody knew that she had a disease that made her unclean. She was having menstrual type bleeding all the time, and so that meant that she shouldn't have been out in public or touching any man. So she's breaking the rules. Her community knows it. The people around her know it. She has touched Jesus' robe, so now she has made him unclean. But Jesus stops and turns to her and says, your faith has made you well. Go. He doesn't condemn her for making him unclean, and he actually makes her ritually clean. But right while this happens, someone comes and says, don't bother the rabbi anymore. Your daughter has died. And so there's muttering about that. And perhaps that is a desire to avoid this potentially awkward situation with Jesus having been made ritually unclean. So he goes and says, no, I'm going to go. So he knows what he's doing here. And he goes to the house, and the girl has apparently died. But Jesus says that she hasn't. And we know that before the advent of modern medicine, it was quite possible for somebody to appear to be dead but actually be in a coma and wake up. They actually used to put dangly bells inside of coffins, so if you woke up in your coffin under the ground, you could ring the bell and someone could come and get you. Gruesome. But point being that Jesus does not want this to be a story of resuscitation, of raising someone from the dead. And Jesus says that she is well and makes her well too. And so it means that whoever we are, whether we are the most holy and respected member of our community, whether we are the one that everyone looks up to or the child of that person, the beloved, the holy, the one who is surrounded by people who love them and accept them, or whether we are the despised and the hated, the pushed aside and forgotten, Jesus will take care of us. We can express our wants and needs to Jesus, and Jesus will be with us through whatever is happening. No matter how hard, no matter how horrible. But if Jesus is on his way to help you, and you are an important person in the synagogue who is well respected, so to speak, if you are an important person in the church, if you are a respected business leader in the community, if you are an elected official beloved by your constituents, Jesus might have to stop on the way and help someone else. because that's the way of Jesus. And that's also the way that we are called to be. To care first for the ones who are most forgotten. In our world today, that means caring for with the right boundaries and the right love those who are addicted and their families and loved ones. It means caring for those who are suffering generational trauma, that if bad things happen to your grandparents and your great-grandparents and your great-great-grandparents, it trickles down to you. And so we are now called, like Jesus, to put first those who have been last. You will still get your share of love and respect if you are an important and powerful person, a beloved business leader. But you might have to wait. Here where God is moving us. Thanks be to God. Amen.